Hello everybody. In the last video of this small tutorial series, we created a working health system with a health bar and the logic for taking damage and healing the player. In this video, we will expand the system by adding the functionality of status effects. We will learn how to create different types of effects, how to add them to the player so that they affect the player's health, and then we will look at the way of removing the effects again. Before we start with this, let's make a few small changes of the code we've written in the last part. In the player.stat script, create a getter method for the current health variable because we are going to grab it from another script. Then create two methods, one called decrease health and one called increase health, because we are going to change the current health variable from another script as well, and this is a clear and easy way to do this instead of making everything public. After that, call the functions where needed. Let's create a script called status effects and attach it to the player. This script will handle the logic for adding status effects to the player and for removing them as well. Create a method named handle status effects, which we will call from the take damage method. To do that, go into the player.stat script and create a reference to the status effects script. Since both scripts are on the same player object, you can get the component in the start function. Then call the handle status effects method in the take damage method right after the player's health gets reduced. For now, the method does not affect the player at all. So let's change that. First, we need to add the status effects which will be added to the player. At the top, create a public enum named damage type. Here, you can add as much effects as you like. I created 4 effects for the moment: normal, poison, fire and electric. Okay. Now, when the player takes damage, we want to know what kind of damage the bullet deals. To do that, add a damage type as a parameter. In the take damage method, add the damage type to the parameter list as well and reference it. Then in the bullet script, create a variable from type damage type and reference it to the take damage method. When you go into the inspector of the bullet, you can now set the type of damage the bullet deals. Let's write some code which will actually affect the player's health depending on which damage type is selected. In the handle status effects method, create a switch statement with various cases for the different damage types. If you do not understand this code, it basically checks if the damage type is, for example, normal, and if it is going to call the code right here. If the damage type is, for example, fire, then this whole code will be ignored and this code will be called. Let's first add the logic for the poison effect so that the player takes a small amount of damage every second. An easy way to do that is to use a coroutine, but before we do that, let's just create a reference to the player.stat script and reference it in the start function. Make sure you write using system.collections at the top. To create a coroutine, just write private enumerator and then the name. In this case, for example, poison damage. Here we want to reduce the player's health by a small amount in an interval of 1 second. So create a float for the amount and a float for the interval. Now create a while loop which checks if the current health of the player is higher than 0, because we only want to damage the player if the health is greater than 0. In the beginning, we created a getter method for the current health variable to get the current health of the player. So let's use this method here. Then we want to decrease the health of the player by the amount. So let's just call the decrease health method of the player.stat script. We also want to update the health bar. So let's just call the setSlider method and reference the current health of the player. Now we want to wait for a second before this code gets called again. The following syntax might seem a little bit weird if you have not worked with coroutines before. Write yield return new wait for seconds and pass in the interval. This code is basically just going to wait for interval amount of seconds, in this case 1 second, and then continues with the code. Now go into the case where the damage type is set to poison and call the coroutine by writing start coroutine and passing in the poison damage coroutine. In the inspector, go into your bullet prefab and set the damage type to poison. When we start the game and the bullet hits us, we now take 2 damage per second. Alright, this is working. But there's one bug. When we get hit by the bullet again, the coroutine gets called again and the damage gets stacked, which is not what we want. So let's make sure to only call the poison damage coroutine if we aren't already poisoned. Create a private boolean which checks if the player is poisoned and set it to false by default. In the poison damage coroutine, set the boolean to true. Now we can only call the poison damage coroutine when we aren't already poisoned. Okay, this should be working. When we are poisoned and get hit by the bullet again, we take the damage of the bullet, but the poison effect does not stack. Alright, we have a way for adding effects to the player. Let's now add a way to remove this effect. Create a new method named clearPoisonEffect. Check if the player is poisoned, because only if the player is poisoned, we want to remove the effect. Now it gets a little bit tricky, because we have to stop the coroutine, which adds the damage to the player. To do that, we need a reference to it. At the top, create a private coroutine called Poison Coroutine. When we start the coroutine, we want to take this coroutine and pass it into the Poison Coroutine. This way, we can just pass in the Poison Coroutine as a parameter into the Stop Coroutine method. If you want to remove all effects at once, for example when the player reaches a checkpoint or whatever, you can also call the Stop All Coroutines method. Lastly, set the isPoison bool to false again. In my scene, I created some simple potions which will remove the poison effect from the player when he collects one of them. Then I created a script called Poison Potion and attached it to them. In the script, I do the same I did with the medkits in the last video. I just check if the player collides with the object and then call the clearPoisonEffect from the statusEffect script. After that, I destroy the object and make sure to make the collider of the potion a trigger. Now, when we are poisoned and collect a potion, the effect is removed and we can get poisoned again. Next, let's add a particle effect so that the user knows what status effect the player currently has. Here are the settings if you want to use the same particles as me. In the statusEffect script, create a reference to the particle effect and reference it in the inspector. For this to work, make sure you made the particle effect a prefab. After that, go into the poison damage coroutine and instantiate the particle effect. Make sure to grab the instantiated object and set the player as its parent so that the effect follows the player. Now when you take damage, the particle system gets instantiated and follows the player. If the effect rotation looks a little bit weird, make sure to set the simulation space to world instead of local. To remove the particle system when the effect gets removed, go into the clearPoisonEffect method, get the particle system and destroy the object. Okay, great. Now we have a system where you can easily add new status effects. In the next part, we will look at how to add armor to the player so that he absorbs a decent amount of damage. If you do not want to miss the next part, make sure to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.